I'm going to go ahead and get started, I believe. They said at 2:30 mark, kick it off, bring everybody back in. So that's my plan. My name is Mark Wolf. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Historical Commission and the State Historic Preservation Officer for Texas. And it's a great pleasure to be here today in my capacity, which I have for 2 more days, I think, as President of the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. Thanks to all of you for your participation here today. As you know, the success of our policy efforts really requires strong partnerships, and one of the most important of those partnerships is the one that we have with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Thinking of my own personal experience, I have to tell you, and this is back in the days of Preservation News, I believe it was called. That's where I first learned that there were professional jobs in historic preservation. I contacted the paper and asked how would I get a degree so that I could do something like that. And they printed in the next issue a list of universities around the country that offered advanced degrees in historic preservation. So I went to school. When I got out, my first job I found in an advertisement in Preservation News, and went to work out in Deadwood. And then when I decided it was time to move on, it was a staff person at the National Trust who helped me to find my next position down in the state of Colorado. So I have a very close and lasting relationship with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm really delighted today to introduce Paul Edmondson, President of the National Trust. He's here this afternoon to tell us about their priorities for the year ahead and to provide us with some of his observations gleaned from his more than 2 decades as legal counsel before he became the president in 2019. Paul, take it away.
Mark, thank you very much. And thank you for your leadership of NTHP. I didn't realize that these were your last 2 days, and it's been just tremendous. Well, first of all, working with you for my lengthy career at the National Trust, but also just seeing you at the helm of NTHP has been fantastic. So thank you for all that. And I want to express my appreciation to both NTHP and Preservation Action for asking me and Merrill to be part of this conversation, to be part of Preservation Advocacy Week. And I also want to thank each of the participants on this program, about 150 people, for being here, but also for helping us advance our common policy objectives. Some of those folks out in the audience know me a little bit. Some of you have known me for many years, like Mark, since I go way back. But if you know me, you also know I've got a deep appreciation of 2 things that are particularly important and relevant to this meeting. The first is really the importance of the preservation community's sustained engagement in federal advocacy. It's so essential, so essential to our work. And then secondly, the importance, as Mark mentioned, of our community working in partnership. It's critical to our success. And that is something that I have had ingrained in me through many years of working as a legal advocate and as a policy advocate. We couldn't do what we do as a preservation movement without those partnerships. So this is a particularly important time for historic preservation advocacy, and I'm going to share some of the ways that the Trust is approaching the new administration and the 117th Congress, and the opportunities we in the sense of the broader preservation movement have before us. And but before I really get into it, I want to start by noting, as both Eric and Russ did this morning, that we would simply not be where we are today without the lasting contribution and the legacy of Nellie Longsworth. Nellie was a pioneer. She was a fighter. She was just an amazing voice for historic preservation. When I started at the Trust in 1987, she was already a legend. And that was because of her tenacity, her dedication, and her tireless energy for the cause, and also her great organizing skills, which is evident, I think, in this meeting. This is part of her legacy. And her contributions as the founding president of Preservation Action and to our movement were really remarkable, as was recognized in 2007 when she was awarded the Louise DuPont Crown and Shield Award, which is, of course, the highest honor that a preservationist can give. So she will certainly be missed. So as Eric noted kind of at the outset in his comments this morning, it's kind of hard to imagine that last year's Advocacy Week was just days before this incredible thing happened to the country and to the world. Just as the impacts of the pandemic were starting to become apparent. And that meeting was not the last meeting, because the meeting of the Advisory Council, Mark will remember, later that week on that Friday, I think was the last meeting that I had, certainly. But that Friday, the 13th, like so many others, the trust closed its offices, we closed our historic sites without really any idea of what was going to be an unprecedented year that would follow. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic, obviously that has been huge, but also the long overdue reckoning on race and justice, and the continuing threat of global climate change, and then more recently, the political environment, and as a result of that, the direct challenges to our democracy. It's been really a remarkable and in many ways tumultuous year. But in this context of upheaval and change, I think there's never really been a more important moment for us to come together to advance the solutions that preservation offers for some of these challenges. And so, guided by our shared values and the social and the economic benefits that we know that preservation provides, I think there's a tremendous opportunity to focus our work both with this new Congress and with the Biden-Harris administration in particular. And I'm going to have an aside here just to note that at the Trust, we are really fortunate to have effective staff members in both the preservation and the law divisions who bring really great skill to this work. And I especially want to report that since January, we've had a new Vice President for Government Relations, Shaw Sprague. So someone who I think many of you know from his work here at the Trust previously. I'm grateful for his strong and collaborative leadership of the government relations team, and particularly his expertise on the tax credit and affordable housing, and great relationships on the Hill. And I also want to thank Tom Cassidy, who many of you know, who's been here for many years in that leadership position, who's moved into the position of senior advisor. And he's done so much to advance the cause of preservation, particularly at the federal level, especially for public lands, grants for underrepresented communities, which we heard a lot about this morning, mapping of cultural resources. His favorite saying, I think, is you can't save it if you can't find it. And of course, the historic tax credit. So, setting that aside, let me just say a few words about our approach to the new administration. I think it's fair to say that what our objective is really right now is to show that the goals of the preservation movement are really fully aligned with the overarching goals of the Biden administration. And specifically that we share a commitment, we as a movement share a commitment to the values of equity, diversity, and inclusion in shaping our nation's historic narrative, and also that historic preservation offers solutions to the objectives of the administration in the areas of economic recovery and environmental sustainability. So I think the essential message I want to kind of leave here is that we have to continually pursue opportunities to deliver this message, this alignment. And obviously we have key opportunities this week with Advocacy Week, but also I think that because this is the start of what's likely to be a Congress that's highly active on our priorities, it's really an opportunity to achieve a lot, I think, in the next 2 years. as major legislation is currently in development in Congress, has been already, it's really essential that we communicate with our congressional offices and reinforce how historic preservation fits within these broader policy objectives. And so just going back to the Biden-Harris administration, in addition to kind of the immediate focus on the pandemic, the Biden-Harris team has really defined these three key pillars of the president's agenda: economic recovery, racial equity, and climate change. And so I think first, we really must be talking to our elected officials and to the administration about how historic preservation is a proven revitalization tool, that it creates jobs, it strengthens communities. It must be viewed as a necessary part of the nation's economic recovery. The Park Service, for example, reports that the historic tax credits created more than 100,000 new jobs each year. In addition, in the annual report that was just issued, and thank you, Brian Gokin and your team, the Park Service reports that the HTC has resulted in $109 billion in rehab investment, rehabbed almost 300,000 housing units, created more than 300,000 new housing units, and produced 178,000 low and moderate income housing units. That's a lot. So I think the other area in particular, this kind of second column, is that our work can really advance the efforts of the administration in the area of racial equity. And so we really must make clear that preservation can be used as an effective tool to advance equity and justice. And we have to back that up with action and with commitment. We've done so much work already to realize preservation's potential in this area, from addressing structural racism in our own organizations and policies to expand the places that we preserve and the tools that we use to support communities. But we have so much more work to do. The current environment demands that we re-examine and we recommit to ensuring that historic preservation, in all the many forms it takes, reflects the full history of this country and strengthens all communities. And finally, the third point, and that is historic preservation has an important contribution to make in the discussion about how we address the climate crisis. We know that building reuse is climate action, and it helps keep carbon from entering the atmosphere. We also know that with tools like better mapping, we will dramatically improve our planning for resiliency in this area. But we have a long way to go to build on our existing efforts. We have to share our different perspectives and identify very specific ways we can advance our goals, not just in this area, but in all of these areas, and make preservation a more resilient and relevant practice. And I should just mention, kind of as an additional aside, that one of the things that the Trust is working to do in this area is develop a national impact agenda. And for those of you who were at the National Preservation Conference last October, you heard about this. It's really to identify the shared values of our movement, and then outline policies and practices that embody those values, and then hold each other accountable in leading the change to put preservation in the center of those values and to meet the challenges of our time. As I said, we started these conversations at the last conference. We're going to continue them with gatherings and convenings and conversations over the next several months. And what we're going to do is we're going to share what we've learned in Preservation Month in May, continue to have further conversations, and then refine these for further discussion at the conference this coming October, Pass Forward 2021. And so I just want to say, if you haven't been engaged or involved in this discussion, I hope you will share your ideas, your thoughts And it's easy to do so. Just send an email to National Impact Agenda, that's one word, at savingplaces.org, and we'll get you involved in the conversation. So let me just say a couple words about the current regulatory environment and the political landscape, and we heard a lot about that earlier this morning at the panel. Last year at this time, we were deeply engaged. I think the entire preservation community was deeply engaged in opposing the proposed changes in the National Register that would really have dramatically impaired the public's ability to nominate, in particular, federally owned properties. We're also particularly concerned about proposed changes to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And at the same time, we were responding to the White House Council on eliminating regulatory barriers to affordable housing. Many of you heard about that council. It listed in its kind of announcement of its plans, it listed historic preservation as a barrier to affordable housing, which, as Sarah Barona noted this morning, is just not the case. We're today in a very different political and regulatory landscape, and that may seem obvious, but it's something that we really have to grasp and run with. So ultimately, the National Register rulemaking, as you all know, did not go into effect. The executive order proposing to streamline NEPA was rescinded by the Biden administration. We still have to look out for that, as was noted this morning, in terms of streamlining for infrastructure. And then on housing, even in the last days of the previous administration, the White House Council reported very clearly that historic preservation can help actually to meet the nation's affordable housing needs. And I have to say, none of these outcomes would have been possible without really a concerted effort by the broader preservation community to come together and to make our voices heard. And again, going back to the current environment, today the Senate is close to approving the nomination of the first Native American cabinet secretary in our nation's history. Congresswoman Haaland's nomination to be Secretary of the Interior promises to bring really a new perspective, fresh perspectives to this position, and I'm sure a renewed commitment to the protection of sacred cultural places and public lands, which is sorely needed, as was noted by in the earlier panel. So we're encouraged by the bipartisan support that Congresswoman Haaland, her nomination has garnered. We're pleased also to be able to indicate our strong support for her nomination. So looking ahead at opportunities, I think there are really a number of reasons for us to feel encouraged about where we are and about how historic preservation is positioned for success in the current Congress. Just recently, for example, we were honored to work with Senator Chris Coons and House Majority Whip Clyburn on the development of legislation to honor and commemorate the historic sites that contributed to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And I think, as many of you know, this is the purpose of this is to expand the Brown v. Board National Historic Site to include other historic sites in affiliated areas that are related to that decision, which was really a collection of court cases. So we hope to see hearings scheduled on this very soon. And also just recently, the passage of the Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald School Study Act just last month, or January, I guess it's March now. And we're really looking forward to the Park Service completing its special resource study, which will bring us one step closer to establishing a new national park unit that not only honors Julius Rosenwald, but has a special focus on the more than 5,000 Rosenwald schools that were constructed in 15 southern states earlier in the 20th century to educate African Americans. So we're also feeling encouraged about efforts to improve the historic tax credit, and I'm sure Merrill will talk further about that in a few minutes. And it's obviously it's taken many years of advocacy to get to this point. Last year, the House passed an infrastructure bill, the Moving Forward Act, that included major improvements to the HTC, including a COVID bump up to 30%, a permanent bump of 30% for small projects, elimination of the basis adjustment to make it more, to make it easier to create affordable housing units, expansion of eligible buildings by modifying the substantial rehab test, and other changes, including changes to the nonprofit rules. So in addition to being really, I think, the most sweeping set of improvements since the credit was made permanent in 1986, this set of changes has the support of the Democratic majority in the House, and I think a real chance to be elected into a law this year. But obviously, this is something that the entire preservation movement needs to get behind. We feel strongly that the starting point for the infrastructure debate in the House will be last year's bill. And we also think that the Senate is going to be committed to passing an infrastructure bill this year. So I think there's a huge opportunity to get these changes in. We've also seen the fourth year of record funding for the Historic Preservation Fund. And so, which is just a tremendous success. We're also closer than we've ever been to funding the Historic Preservation Fund at its fully authorized level of $150 million. And this is really a testament to all of you, to NTHP, to Preservation Action, to the work of the entire preservation community, to educate Congress about the important ways that SHPOs and TIPOs support our communities, how funding for grant programs like the African American Civil Rights Program, Civil Rights for All Americans, those grants, represented community grants, and as we heard earlier, HBCU funding. Those all advance racial equity objectives, and they will help us achieve a more just and equitable society. So we'll all turn our attention soon to reauthorizing the HPF and hope to do so at levels that account for growth for all of these important programs and the many ways that historic preservation really creates vibrant, thriving communities. And then last, I want to mention, and certainly not least, we're really excited by the good work that the National Main Street Center is doing and has done over the last year to pursue direct funding support for downtown community development organizations. Our Main Street communities, they continue to suffer really severe economic challenges, obviously longstanding, exacerbated tremendously by COVID. And Main Street has developed a proposal to create a national competitive grant program that would use the expertise of national nonprofit partners to provide support for the nation's downtown small businesses. The response we've had from the Hill has been very encouraging on both sides of the aisle. So hopefully we'll hear more about this. So just kind of to go back where I started, to take advantage of all these opportunities, your focus on federal advocacy this year in particular will be incredibly important so that we can achieve all that we're trying together to do. So I wanted to end by saying really where I started from, which is thank you, thanks to everyone on this Zoom for your engagement on these issues. We really appreciate our partnership with NTHP, with Preservation Action, and with all of you, and look forward over the next year to a lot of hard work in seeing that we can make the preservation movement stronger, more equitable, and more widely recognized as an important way to strengthen and support communities across the country. So good luck with the meetings you all will have this week. Thanks to the dedication you show for preservation at all levels of government. And I look forward, hopefully, to seeing you all in person before too long. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your very inspirational and thoughtful, positive comments. I really appreciate it. It's so easy for us over the course of the past year to take on a little too much gloom, and I think that we've all been beat up a little bit. It's really nice to hear so many positive comments, and I share very much in your optimism that this is going to be a fabulous year. Historic preservation not only hasn't been part of the problem, we are very much part of the solution. So thank you for your comments.
Thanks, Mark.
Over the years, of course, we all have advocated a lot for the historic tax credit. Most of our meetings on the Hill have been focused on that, among other issues. One of the key players in that effort, of course, is the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. And here today to provide us with the latest information about the most recent legislation and proposed changes to the tax credit is Merrill Hoopengardner, President of the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. Merrill?
Great, thank you, Mark. And I'm gonna share some slides and really unpack some of the things that Paul just talked about in the opportunity we have in front of us this year to pursue meaningful substantive change at the federal level with the historic tax credit. I had the privilege of talking with many of you a couple of years ago in the year of tax reform, and I know that seems like eons ago, especially after what 2020 had in store for us. But in 2017, we had an unprecedented opportunity to really fight for survival, to remind members of Congress how important the historic tax credit is, what it has done in our communities around the country, and why they should keep it in the tax code. We had some unfinished business then. You'll recall that whole tax reform thing actually went down in a 6-week period of time between when we saw the first draft, real draft legislation that would have eliminated us to when we were able to get it back in the Senate draft. And then the Senate provision actually controlled and we were saved, but the credit was impacted. And we're really just starting to see how that is hitting the streets now. There's a couple-year grandfathering period that was built into the transition rule. So folks who had 20% tax credits still have 20%, but they're now starting to earn them over a 5-year period. So we already knew pre-COVID that we needed to continue working with our champions on the Hill to make the credit more dynamic and effective. We've long said that for many of you who work at the state level doing advocacy too, that the states are the true laboratory of innovation for what we want to do at the federal level. So some of our provisions we've been working on for a while come from that experience we've seen with state tax credit programs that are really effective in ways that we could improve the federal credit. So I'm going to walk us through a little bit of where we've come in 2020 and talk about some of the specifics that we still have in the legislation. So if you have opportunities to meet with our champions on the Hill this week, you can tell them thank you. If you have an opportunity to meet with new members of Congress, you'll have some talking points about how the historic tax credit could be improved. As Paul said, as both an economic recovery tool and also as a way of being able to tell the full American history and do the things that are unique, save the buildings and the stories that are unique in each of our communities. So I'm gonna start by talking about the bad news, right? Where we've been in this last year. As the subsidiary of the National Trust that works on tax credit transactions, we felt this squeeze all year. We had more than 75 historic tax credit projects in our asset management portfolio at the onset of COVID, and we had dozens of projects that were somewhere in process, that were trying to get financing, that were trying to keep their financing, that were under construction, trying to get complete. We saw challenges really across the country. It kind of came in waves as shutdown orders happened, but it crested very quickly. So we had projects shut down completely, limited availability to have skilled workers on site, needing to separate people, which added to their cost. You see one of our projects in Cleveland behind me as my virtual background. Cleveland was a great example of a city that had some restrictions on how many people could be in any one space working on projects. And so you had to, instead of having 3 workers in a room working on the new apartment units that were being built out, you could only have 1 worker in a spot at a time. That time and additional labor cost adds to cost. We also had delays in supplies that were received, and historic preservation work is also seeing some of the same challenges. New construction, where timber, steel, other materials are much more expensive than they were a couple of years ago. And then the supply chain, as things are moving around our country or coming from outside the country in. We had a project that was trying to get its marble countertop delivered from Italy. That didn't happen in the middle of the summer. They're still having some challenges finding the right materials. So all of that, again, added to cost, and it added to time. Things that take more time, again, add to cost. So we see the financing gaps widening in many historic preservation projects. Meanwhile, the people writing the checks for this have also been under strain. Your lender, your investor, those are folks who probably have tighter underwriting requirements. They also have concern about what the end use of this project might be. Across our portfolio, we have things like hospitality, education, office, retail. All of those are asset classes significantly impacted by COVID in the last year. And so as people think further ahead, when are things going to normalize again? You have lenders and investors who are going to discount projections. They're going to assume it's going to take a little bit longer for things to ramp back up. And so that, again, is kind of adding to this imbalanced equation between the cost it takes to rehab these historic properties and the financing that's available to make that happen. So the current situation has shaped a lot of the advocacy work we've done this year to be able to go to Congress and say, we've long had some things that would do more for the historic tax credit. It would make more buildings eligible, it would bring more value to the credit, and it would allow more types of operations to happen in historic buildings. We also now say we need more credits because we need to fill that gap that's been created in this last year. Over the course of this last year, we've been closely working with our champions in Congress. So with the IRS directly, one of our regulatory partners, in addition to the work we do with SHPOs and the National Park Service, the IRS had to consider and had to be nudged and encouraged a little bit with our champions on the Hill that timing delays were impacting credits, and people might not be able to get the credits they expected because they couldn't complete their projects in the right period of time. So that was an emergency ramp up we needed to do to ensure that historic tax credits would still be made available to people even if they got stalled in the middle of their rehab. This is when we came forward with the 30% bump up idea. This is really modeled on the GO Zone legislation that passed after Hurricane Katrina and then was implemented by Congress again after there had been widespread flooding in the Midwest. So we have members of Congress who remember that the HTC has been enhanced in previous years when we needed to bump up to deal with a natural disaster. Now we're framing it in terms of the COVID disaster, that there's been a national disaster based on the pandemic that's then created these economic challenges, that the historic tax credit is well suited and has an easy mechanism in place to address. This was also our opportunity, as Paul said, to look at what the House was starting to do and shaping what we now expect is going to be the starting point for an infrastructure bill later in 2021. So in working with our champions on the Hill, we were able to get both short-term provisions and long-term priorities in HR2, the Moving Forward Act, that was passed by the House. So this is the furthest down the field we've seen a piece of historic tax credit legislation move since tax reform, and tax reform was defensive. So from an offensive perspective, this is the furthest we've gotten our bill down the field in years and years and years. So making steady incremental progress to our ultimate goal of getting it passed. This had the short-term bump up, as we talked about. We also have a little bit of a tail on the fall, kind of end of it. So you'd get a 30% bump up from 2020 through 24. And then for costs incurred in those ending years, you wouldn't have a cliff back to 20%, you'd phase back down again. We also used the Moving Forward Act as the place to say, in addition to the letter that the Historic Tax Credit Coalition and others sent to the IRS, raising the alarm bell about the cliff on the substantial rehab test for projects in motion, the HR2 bill also signaled that Congress and that the full House wanted the IRS to take this under consideration. We also asked for permanent changes to the credit. So as you all know, we've long been working with Congress to try to get a bump up in the credit percentage for small projects, because we recognize that the friction essentially built into the tax credit program, the cost to bring professionals in, the challenges with fixed costs associated with projects make smaller deals less attractive, particularly when you need to bring in other sources of capital and you can have another investor invest in your project and claim the credits if the developer can't use the credits him or herself. So that's a key piece of our permanent request, is to have this bump up continuously stay on for our small projects. We would also do a couple things that would make more buildings eligible. This seems like super wonky tax language, but we want to lower the substantial rehab test threshold. Congress essentially has said for a long time, you have to substantially rehab your historic building. We think substantial rehab doesn't mean you have to spend more than your building's worth the day you start. That's the way the tax roll works today. Rather, you should only have to spend half as much as what your building's worth today. That seems more like a substantial rehab than the full rehab that's essentially built into the code today. So lowering that threshold would make more buildings eligible. And it particularly helps when you've got a lot of replacement kind of systems work you need to do, especially if you're trying to make your building more energy efficient or do some other things like that, but you're not doing a full gut rehab. So these projects would now be available. We'd also eliminate the basis adjustment. So that is taking away another one of the tax attributes that makes the credit expensive. You're essentially getting a credit on one hand and the government is taxing you on the other. It's also, as a former tax lawyer, I can tell you job security for tax lawyers and accountants. So we want to simplify the credit and make the basis adjustment go away. It also would make the historic credit pair better with the low-income housing credit and with opportunity zones. Again, making this a more effective tool for the kind of community serving work we want to do. And then finally, we'd be able to make the credit more functional for nonprofit sponsored projects. Again, making it available for more buildings and more uses. HR2 also had Congressman Evans' Rehabilitation of Historic Schools Act, which isn't work we've been directly involved in, but you see Congress setting a broader stage for what they're looking for this year in historic preservation. Before we even had to get the Senate to act on the Moving Forward Act, the IRS actually changed the law in the way we were asking. So as you'll see here, people now do have the extension through March of this year, through the end of this month, to have met the substantial rehab test. So if you had a delay last year, you still had 6, 9, or 12 months left that you could get your project placed in service. So we think that's a great win. So if I look for where we're headed now, we are in the process of having conversations with many folks that you'll be talking with on the Hill this week, bringing forward these proposals that I just talked about, having the HR2 provisions as the suggested starting point for a new bill, hoping that that bill will then be incorporated into the next big tax legislation to move, which would ideally be an infrastructure bill later this year. Here are a few folks to keep an eye out for if you're having meetings with them this year. I know if you've done a lot of advocacy work with the Historic Preservation Fund, you're used to talking with members of Congress who were doing appropriations related work. All of the tax related work is managed by the Senate Finance Committee and by the House Ways and Means Committee. So I wanted to make sure you had those names in front of you so you know these are some key decision makers in moving tax legislation forward. So that was the Senate, and these are the House members. We also want to make sure you know who our prior champions have been. So again, think about saying first, thank you, if somebody has been our champion before, and then you can say please when you want to ask for the next thing, and then end with thank you again, of course. A thank you sandwich is the way we think about our advocacy work. So these are the folks who were the co-sponsors of our HTC Go bill in the last Congress. The folks who've been lined out aren't members of Congress anymore, so you can forget them. Recognize though that, as I showed on the last screen, some new tax writing committee members have been added for folks who moved on. And obviously there's just a different composition of both the House and the Senate. Bipartisan support we've had for a long time, and we want to continue to have that. So here are the folks that have said yes to us before and will be our starting point for building a group of interested champions as we move forward with legislation this year. And here are our companion co-sponsors in our prior legislation in the Senate. Because the Senate has switched hands this year narrowly in January, now that the Democrats lead in the Senate, we expect that the Senate bill will be led by Democrats. But again, this bipartisan collaboration that we've had with these key 4 members that we anticipate will be working with us again this year as we shape the final bill language. So here's the quick summary for you. You don't have to think about all the wonky tax stuff that's in it. If you can think about approaching your members of Congress to say, we're hoping to work with you this year to make some temporary COVID post-pandemic economic recovery impacts to the credit, to take the credit that is the federal government's biggest financial investment in historic preservation, proven tool since 1981, to rehab buildings and to revitalize communities. We want to bring more dollars to that to supercharge our economic recovery. In addition, we want the credit to be more functional, easier to use, and accessible to all sorts of projects, especially community serving projects that align with the priorities of the new administration, as Paul talked about a few minutes ago. So the permanent bump for small projects, and then lowering the sub-rehab test and eliminating the basis adjustment. Again, things that just increase the number of buildings available, simplify the tax rules, and make nonprofit sponsored projects easier to accomplish. We think any day now, any week now, at some point this month, this is one of those you plan, God laughs, you plan, Congress laughs sometimes. We can't quite control their calendar or how they are working on so many different priorities right now. But we've made a lot of progress, had some great conversations with our champions on the Hill in the last couple of months. So we think we'll have some sort of bill that hopefully has these provisions I just outlined yet this month. As you're talking to people this week, I encourage you to tell them what's going on the ground in your communities right now, the challenges you're having, getting the work done, getting the capital you need to do, and how these provisions will make historic preservation more accessible and get these buildings back online, being economically productive in your community. You could also think ahead one last step to, we hope you would get on our bill when it comes out, and please think of the historic tax credit as part of infrastructure. It's the key part of what keeps our communities intact. So think of it in addition to bridges and roads and other ways that people conceive of infrastructure. So we will hopefully hitch up to that wagon as it moves later this year. If you need more resources, I encourage you to look at this link, which brings you to the National Trust's forum site. You can get maps for most districts and for any state, and it'll show you projects that have been done and ones that are in the queue ready to be done. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to take questions if there's any time remaining, or please feel free to reach out to me or my colleague Mike Phillips at NTCIC, and we're happy to chat with you about how to follow up with meetings that you're having this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Merrill. Appreciate that very much. Sounds like there's just so much going on, and it's all very positive and exciting. So thank you. We have things to look forward to in our ongoing meetings. So at this point, I'm turning it over to Russ. If Russ is available, Russ Carnahan.
If I might jump in, there were a few questions. Merrill, if you're still available to answer. Elizabeth Rosen wanted to know, do you still expect the HTC Go components to be part of a larger package like infrastructure?
We definitely do. And in conversations we've had with particularly some of the folks who are already working on infrastructure package in the House, which will likely move forward first with any draft legislation. We know that they are thinking of the historic tax credit and the HTC Go provisions top of mind. So we're very hopeful that HTC Go would be in the first draft of infrastructure legislation. I think there's some mechanics still for Congress to work out and how an infrastructure bill would move forward, whether it would be modeled on this approach they've taken right now with the American Rescue Plan or with others. But regardless of how that happens, we think we will be incorporated into a first draft that would come out later this year.
Awesome. Is it okay for us to put your email address in the chat? Some folks were wondering if they could use your PowerPoint as the talking points. Okay,
Yeah,
we'll go ahead
absolutely.
and do that. Thank you. Okay. Well, we wanted to have time for a break. Thank you, Merrill and Paul, so much. Let's go to break until 3:30, and we'll be back then.